Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first Coffee with the Curators, a program we're putting on to complement our temporary exhibit, A Time for Greatness, the 1960 Kennedy Campaign. I hope you get a chance to visit the exhibit if you haven't been in there yet. We're going to field questions about the exhibit downstairs, any questions you may have about the assassination, or about the museum. It's informal, so we hope you'll just raise your hand and we'll repeat your question so everybody can hear it. And of course, we have coffee, so if you would like some coffee, please help yourselves. I'm Lindsey Richardson, the Curator of Collections here at the museum. This is my colleague.
I'm Stephen Fagin, the Curator.
We have some questions that people have given us already, so we will start you off, and then just raise your hand and we'll start feeding in your questions too, okay? So, Stephen, I'm going to start by asking you, of all the things that we put on display in A Time for Greatness, what is your favorite artifact?
We have about 100 artifacts on display in this temporary exhibit. It was interesting to look through what we had related to the 1960 campaign because it's a part of the story which is extremely important, yet we don't get to focus on it very much. But if there was no 1960 campaign, if there was no election, then we wouldn't be here today talking about what happened in November of 1963. As far as what we have on display that I think is, to me, one of the most meaningful or significant artifacts is actually the cup that we're promoting today. You'll see it's a Coffee with Kennedy cups, which is sort of given the theme to this Coffee with the Curators talk today. And the reason I like this little paper cup is, one, the one that we have on display is an original paper cup. And if you can imagine a cup like that surviving in great condition from the 1960 election, a little throwaway paper cup, surviving to the point where it's now in a museum today in 2016. What did you do with the last paper cup you had filled with coffee? You probably just threw it away, but someone saved that cup and preserved it and took very good care of it. But what I like about that cup is the stories that I've heard surrounding it. We have a very robust oral history project at the museum. We've talked to over 1,500 people from around the world about their memories of the Kennedy assassination, and one person told me a story about Coffee with Kennedy. And every time I see that cup on display, I think about that story. So I'll just very briefly share it with you. This was a young man who had been a lifelong Republican, grew up in a very staunchly conservative family, and he actually was a page at the 1956 Republican National Convention. And during that time, in 56, he got to meet President Eisenhower. He got to shake hands with then Vice President Nixon, and so he was a big Nixon fan. So by 1960, he was a Nixon supporter. He was in college at this point, and a buddy of his was going to a Kennedy rally, specifically a Coffee with Kennedy, one of these little intimate Coffee with Kennedy gatherings, and he told his Republican buddy, you need to come down. This guy is really interesting. You owe it to yourself just to see him in person. And so very reluctantly, this Nixon supporter went to Coffee with Kennedy. It was pouring down rain, and they ended up having this little Coffee with Kennedy gathering on the stage of a high school auditorium. Very dark, the theater seats were dark, and Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy was there too. They invited people up to the stage, and they sat around in these little folding chairs, very similar to what we're doing today, except we would be in folding chairs too. It was an extraordinarily intimate thing. No security presence, at least no visible security presence at all. And Kennedy sort of just went down the line and engaged each person individually, making eye contact with each person, inviting them to ask whatever questions they had about the 1960 election, the issues that mattered to them at that moment. And the coda to the story is that this fierce Nixon supporter, this young college student, was swept up in the idealism and the charisma of John F. Kennedy. And in that moment, on that stage, in the midst of Coffee with Kennedy, he became a Democrat and remains so to this day here in 2016. So that's the power that a cup of coffee can have in determining your presidential candidate. So I suppose in light of that story and the fact that I think of it every time I see that artifact, that would have to be my favorite one. What about you?
I have a slightly different favorite artifact. I don't know if you guys have been through the exhibit, but if you go through and turn right, go past the interactive Campaigning for Kennedy office, there is an artifact case with a bright red hat on display. And we have had that hat in our collections for almost 20 years. And we had a note that said it was a campaign hat. But it's not like other campaign hats. It doesn't have Kennedy's face or name. It doesn't even have a PT-109 boat on it. It has inside, it has a label saying it was sold at Neiman Marcus. But it's just a red lady's hat. And as we were doing the research for this exhibit, we were calling up all of the images and things that we have in our collections related to the 1960 campaign. And we had a handful of color snapshots that were taken by a woman who lived here in Dallas. She went out to Main Street on September 12th, 1960, when Richard Nixon came to campaign here. And she took pictures of Richard and Pat Nixon. You can see one in the exhibit. And then the next day, September 13th, she went back out and took pictures again when John F. Kennedy came to town. Her pictures of Kennedy faded. They were on a different kind of film than the pictures of Nixon. So the Nixon film, we could look at it and we knew what it was, but the pictures of the Kennedy visit were very sort of swishy purple looking. You couldn't really tell what was going on. So we asked our graphic design guru to have a look at the digital scan that we made of these images, and he brightened them up and sharpened them up so that we could see what the original colors were like. And there is a car full of women with a big sign that says, "Campaign for Kennedy, come to our headquarters on Main Street," and every one of them is wearing one of those red hats. And we got so excited because we didn't know that we had an image of the hat from one collection that came from a different lady. And we had the hat itself. We had a campaign hat that was something that the women volunteers who liked to organize things for the local Democratic Kennedy support campaign were wearing this hat. So for me, I like that because it was, I'm the curator of collections and I like to deal with the things in collections. So the fact that we solved a mystery and got to put it on display and show you guys that got me kind of excited. I like that.
What questions do you folks have about the campaign or the assassination or the museum you're in today? This site, Dealey Plaza, National Historic Landmark site. We have plenty of pre-planned questions here, but I want to offer the opportunity for you guys to engage us because it's always fun to talk to people about the site and its history and why we're all here.
No question, too random.
How long has the museum been open?
How long has the museum been open?
Our museum opened on President's Day, February 20th, 1989. But the story of what to do with this site really begins 24 hours after the Kennedy assassination. You know, within 24 hours, Dealey Plaza became the most visited site in Dallas, and this building, the Texas School Book Depository, one of the world's most photographed structures, and that's an actual quote from the Dallas Morning News from the weekend of the assassination. Dallasites really didn't know what to do with this building. As you can imagine, it was a site of great pain and local tragedy. Dallas bearing this stigma as the city where President Kennedy was killed, and there was an effort, a serious effort to tear down the building that went on into the 1970s, and it actually went before the Dallas City Council for a vote. It was a split vote, and ultimately they temporarily froze demolition permits on the building, which enabled Dallas County, the government of Dallas County, to step in and buy the building, and they renovated it in the late 70s and early 80s. And today, where you're sitting here in this building, this is actually the seat of Dallas County government. Commissioner's Court is on the ground floor, and offices on the second floor. Public Works is on the fourth floor. The Civil Division of the DA's office is on the fifth floor. But no one really knew what to do with the sixth and seventh floors. Can you imagine being a county official and you were told your office is going to be in the southeast corner on the sixth floor and where the sniper's perch was? It would be a terrible thing to waste historic space like that, to cheapen it in a way by making it just part of county bureaucracy. And they recognized that, and they recognized that despite it being painful local history, it was meaningful history that the nation and the world still cared about. And so ultimately, a grassroots effort began, and after about 12 years of controversial development, the sixth floor came to be. It was opened as an exhibition in 1989, and we are now, Dealey Plaza is the second most visited historic site in the state of Texas behind the Alamo in San Antonio. So there is still so much interest in this site, even though more than 2/3 of our visitors weren't alive in 1963. Looking out at our crowd here, I think very few of you were probably alive at the time of the assassination.
Has any member of the Kennedy family visited?
We get asked that question a lot, and the response we have is that there have been members of the family who have visited, but out of respect for their privacy and the privacy of all of our visitors, we never discuss individual visits to the museum.
Any other questions? Yes.
I read downstairs that 61% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy behind the assassination. Has that number changed over the years?
He says he's read downstairs that 61% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy in the assassination of the president, and has that number changed over the years? Stephen, you want to jump in here?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Much like political polls that shift from week to week, belief in a conspiracy seems extremely flexible and organic depending upon the context of our times. So in the immediate aftermath of the release of the Warren Commission report in 1964, the vast majority of Americans were very satisfied with the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed the president, wounded the governor. Jack Ruby, acting alone, killed Oswald, no connection between Oswald and Ruby. That dynamic began to shift almost immediately because the critical literature that began to come out really in 65 through 67, the first wave of critical research, Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, Sylvia Maher's Accessories After the Fact, Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas, these books, which are now considered sort of classics of conspiracy literature, really began to shift. And that it was that belief that there may be more to the story than just Lee Harvey Oswald, in part with revelations that occurred around the time of Watergate. That's what ushered in that second government investigation in the 70s, the House Select Committee on Assassination. And really, from the 70s on, because of Vietnam and Watergate, as we began to lose faith in our government and believe that most of what the government said to us might not be all that true, that sort of skepticism ingrained itself in the consciousness of this story. And so in the 1970s, some polls found that more than 80% of Americans believed in a conspiracy. That number wavered a little bit throughout the late 70s and into the 80s. Around the 25th anniversary of the assassination, it was around 75%. It spiked again in the early 90s with Oliver Stone's film JFK, which is this phantasmagoria of conspiracy conjecture. And then it's in the aftermath of the Stone film in 91, it's really sort of, the pendulum has just slid a little bit back towards the center. The Gallup poll that we quote downstairs at 61%, which was in 2013, around the 50th anniversary, give or take, that's the lowest the conspiracy number has been for a number of years. And so, but it could be any moment that it could shift back and forth. But it's worth noting that regardless of the specific numbers, whether we're talking 60%, 70%, 80%, people believe in a conspiracy. More people have believed in a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination since the 1960s than they believe that Oswald acted alone. Great question. Thank you very much for that. Other questions before I reach into my secret stash? Yes?
There's a photo on the wall in the Time for Greatness exhibit, and somebody's holding a sign that says, "We won't trade Texas chili for Yankee," and then it's
Pot roast.
Oh, pot
Yeah.
roast.
Was that your that was your question?
Yeah, sitting behind the crowd. I was wondering what that last name
That's that was part of the protest outside the Adolphus, I believe, which, not coincidentally, there'll be actually a gallery talk all about that very contentious visit that Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson paid to Dallas just 4 days before the election, where he was met with a crowd of more than 100 demonstrators, and some really interesting hijinks went down. So I'll be talking about that. But yeah, that was one of many signs that was just criticizing Johnson because he was a sellout. He got on a ticket with a Yankee, a Massachusetts senator, a liberal Massachusetts senator, and Johnson completely shocked all of his Southern colleagues when he basically gave up what many consider to be one of the most significant and influential posts in the United States government, the majority leader of the United States Senate, to be essentially what they called the bag man for John F. Kennedy and be on the vice presidential ticket. So he was very criticized among his Southern colleagues for that, and some of the Southern delegation threatened to walk out because of shifting views on civil rights and things like that. In the end, it was one of the greatest decisions in modern political history, because had Johnson not joined the Kennedy ticket, it's very likely Kennedy would have lost the entire South. He carried Texas by a very slim majority. But it was very fortuitous that he invited Johnson and Johnson accepted. And of course, then Johnson became president following the assassination in '64. Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak to the personal relationship that Kennedy had with Johnson?
Yeah, the question was about the relationship that Kennedy had with Lyndon Johnson. Much has been made of the fact that Kennedy and Johnson weren't very close. But, that's not all that uncommon when you consider relationships between presidents and vice presidents. Eisenhower and Nixon had a much colder relationship than Kennedy and Johnson. That's something that a lot of people don't talk about, but Eisenhower actively tried to drop Nixon from the ticket in '56. There were some rumors around the time of the assassination that as Kennedy was gearing up for the 1964 re-election campaign, he might drop Johnson from the ticket, but there's no truth to that whatsoever, because Kennedy knew, above all else, he needed a Southerner on the ticket. He had come out in support of civil rights in the summer of '63. He was in really hot water throughout the South, and he needed someone like Johnson who was, as far as Southern politicians went, very moderate, or at least flexible in his political positions. He, sat on the fence quite a lot in order to please both sides of the aisle. But Kennedy needed Johnson, and Johnson recognized that. Now, where the real animosity existed in the Kennedy administration was between Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, who was, Attorney General, and Lyndon Johnson. Going way back, Bobby and Lyndon Johnson just hated each other. And it really goes back to the Democratic National Convention in 1960. A lot of people don't realize that Lyndon Johnson declared his candidacy for the presidency in 1960, or for the Democratic nomination for president, just a few days before the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. Kennedy went in. We heard a lot of talk this past few months about, would Donald Trump have the votes necessary to secure the nomination on the first ballot? And that was a real issue for Kennedy in 1960 in Los Angeles. He went in there without the solid number he needed to get the nomination on the first ballot. And so, sensing blood in the water, Lyndon Johnson and also two-time Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson both threw their hats in the ring at the last minute right before the convention, hoping to cause a stir and shift all this support away from Kennedy. They underestimated the power of the Kennedy machine, particularly Brother Bobby, who was the campaign manager. And I don't think Bobby ever forgave Johnson for causing the problems he did for the Kennedy team in Los Angeles. And Bobby was absolutely opposed to Johnson being on the ticket. He was so angry when Johnson accepted, and I think there was a great deal of anger and frustration directed at Lyndon Johnson after the assassination by the sheer fact that he became president. And you see that reflected also in '68 when Bobby was fully prepared, I think, to run against Johnson should Johnson have sought re-election in 1968, but Johnson saved everybody the trouble and announced he would not seek a second term. But so I think in describing that dynamic, there was far more animosity between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson than John F. Kennedy, although they weren't exactly close, but that's not uncommon. Great question. Thank you.
Yes?
We have 50,000 artifacts in our collections. How do you go about choosing what to put up on such an exhibit? Because there's only 100 out there.
Well, it's funny because
Repeat the question.
Yes, she asked if we have more than 50,000 items in our collections, how do we choose the 100 that are on display in this exhibit? Well, first of all, from a museum point of view, 100 objects on display, that's a pretty big number. We're pretty excited about that. But a big collection of 50,000 items. We have records of the information that we associate with each individual item. So when we sat down at the beginning of our process and thought, how are we going to put together an exhibit about the 1960 election? I spent a few days going through all of our records, trying to figure out anything related to 1960, to that date, to Kennedy, Johnson, to Nixon, to any of the campaigning materials that we had, any of the things that might be related to the 1960 campaign. I pulled all of that together And then we sat down as a group and started going through it and looking for what was interesting and what told stories and what would people find fascinating when they come to the museum. So we tried to find as many shiny, cool, three-dimensional objects in our collections as possible. We have all of those on display. But there are also a lot of great images. So you'll see some throughout the gallery. We have some of them blown up really large, so you can take your picture with them. We hope you'll campaign for Kennedy or shake hands with Kennedy in there. But we found, like the snapshots I was talking about earlier, we found all kinds of images that, like Stephen said earlier, we don't often get to use because our core story is about the assassination in '63. But this is the chapter before that. It's the prologue. And you have to have the prologue to set up the rest of what came later. And we're excited to be able to use all of these things. So it's probably about 120 if you count all the images and all the artifacts. We were really super excited. So I hope you'll go in and look at them all. Thank you.
I'm wondering about
Yes.
the bookshop itself. How many employees, what type of outlet was it?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
About the bookshop itself,
Oh, the museum store downstairs?
yeah, when it was in 1962.
Oh, in 1963, the Texas School Book Depository.
How many employees were there?
How many employees were at the book
Yeah,
depository?
that's a good question. As far as okay, you have to understand the way the building was made up at that time. The Texas School Book Depository was a distribution hub for school textbooks. This building received books from book manufacturers, book publishers, and they would ship them out to schools in North Texas, also Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and New Mexico. They weren't just sending books out to Texas schools, but all the surrounding states as well. So there was a group of like order fillers. Lee Harvey Oswald was employed by the building. He was a temporary employee. They had been hiring additional employees in part. This is a long, complicated answer to your question, but they were laying new floor in the building. Okay, so going back just a tiny bit. Before it was the Texas School Book Depository, it was a grocery headquarters for the John Sexton Company, so they were storing food and groceries on the different floors. And so oil from some of the food stored by the Sexton Company had leached into the wooden floorboards of the 6th floor and 7th floor and the 5th floor. So when the Texas School Book Depository moved in, which was in late '62, early '63, imagine if it had been 1 year later, we'd be here talking about the John Sexton building rather than the Texas School Book Depository. But they were finding that their cardboard book boxes were getting ruined by all the oil that had been left over from when it was a grocery wholesaler's warehouse. So they were laying all new plywood flooring on the building. They were diverting regular employees to this process of going floor by floor, and they were hiring temporary employees, including Lee Harvey Oswald. So they had order fillers. I want to say they had around 15 or 20 doing this sort of daily work, working for the actual school book depository company in the building. There were administrators, there were managers. Bill Shelley was the manager of the building at that time. Jack Kaysen was president of the Texas School Book Depository Company. But then there were also on some of the other floors, 2, 3, and 4, regional offices for some of the book publishers like Scotts Forsman, McGraw-Hill, school book companies that are still in business today. And so they would have usually an account representative representing the regional office, 2 or 3 secretaries, a couple of librarian-type book order associates, those sorts of things, many of which witnessed the assassination. So as far as how many total people, I don't know the exact number, but I would say 50 or more probably employed in the 7-story building at the time of the assassination. Good question. Yeah.
You get a lot of foreign visitors here?
We do, yeah. Our audio tour is in a number of
I think
languages.
it's 7
Is it 7
languages?
now?
7.
Plus a children's version in English. Yeah, we have a sign language audio tour. Well, it's a sign language tour that you can access from iPad. So we have a lot of diverse visitors, but particularly from all around the world. We get a lot of visitors, I know, from England and Australia. Germany. Kennedy is still very popular in Germany and Japan. Really from all over the world. It's impossible to single out a specific country, but I think it's a mix of the broad popular appeal of someone like John F. Kennedy, whose rhetoric, if you pluck out quotes, as we often do in social media and elsewhere, a lot of Kennedy's words were poetically vague enough that they still apply direct meaning to our lives today. And I think a lot of people find inspiration from the words of Kennedy and just the charisma of Kennedy, no matter where you are in the world or what you're facing in your life. And so I think you see that reflected. Plus, the fascination with a site like Dealey Plaza, the site of one of the turning points in 20th century American history, you know. There are a few places in this country, other than maybe Gettysburg, a Civil War battlefield, perhaps, where you can, you know, point to a geographic location and you can say with some certainty that world history changed on this spot. But if you folks walk out there on the north side of Elm and look down at the ground, you can find one of those spots where the history of not just this country, but the whole of the entire world changed in November of 1963. You know, that there's a reason why there's all these books and films and, you know, Stephen King's novel. What would have happened had the assassination not taken place? What would the world we live in today be like? You know, that's been covered all the way back in the 60s with TV shows like The Twilight Zone. But there is a real palpability in a sacred space like Dealey Plaza, this unfulfilled hope and promise. And you see that reflected in the eyes of our visitors, whether they're from Texas or whether they're from Japan or Australia.
Can I ask you guys a question? So we are in an election year. This is an exhibit about the election. I don't know how many of you have been through or not, but did you know before you came here today how close the election was between Nixon and Kennedy? If you knew how close it was, raise your hand, please. Okay, so this is a fascinating part of the story. Nixon lost that election by 0.1% of the popular vote. Now, Kennedy had a lot more of the Electoral College votes. He concentrated his campaign on the states with a lot of Electoral College votes. But the popular vote was literally neck and neck. And it could have been Nixon who was elected. He could have chosen to contest the outcome, and he chose not to, keeping in mind that at that time they were in the middle of the Cold War, and they didn't really want people like Khrushchev in Russia to see America squabbling over who was going to be leading America. But I just wondered if you guys knew that. So if you go in there and read a little bit about the outcome of the exhibit and the election and what happened toward the end of the exhibit, you'll see there's a map that shows how close it was and how very nearly history was a little bit different than the way we know it. On that topic, one of our staffers asked a good question. On that map, Stephen, there is I think it's like a state and a half that ended up, it was Mississippi and part of Alabama, did not go for the Republican or the Democratic candidate. They went for an independent. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. It all comes down to civil rights. Kennedy had, towards the end of the general election cycle, he had helped, or his brother Bobby had helped get Martin Luther King released from a Georgia jail, and Nixon had not done anything in that part. So it shifted. The race was still very much in play as far as where would this growing population of African Americans cast their vote, for the party of Lincoln, the Republicans with Richard Nixon, or for John F. Kennedy, who had always been very friendly with Southern segregationists. And so it was still very back and forth. But in the end, thanks really to a staffer named Harris Wofford, who later became a U.S. Senator, and Sergeant Shriver, Kennedy called Coretta Scott King, pledged his support to her, and then Bobby actually called the judge in Georgia and helped to get King released. And that immediately shifted the African-American vote in Kennedy's favor. And it also introduced, with the Southern delegation, accusations that Kennedy had gone soft on civil rights. He was no longer friends to the segregationists. And so some of the undeclared Democratic delegates, the ones who were not attached to a specific candidate, in this case John F. Kennedy, decided to sort of cast a protest vote and voted for the independent candidate. It had no effect, really. I mean, you could argue that Kennedy could have had he shored up more support with the Democratic Party, he could have beaten Nixon by a wider margin, but still it was a protest vote specifically because of civil rights. That sort of thing really only happened again one time, and that was in 1968, which was one of the darkest years in modern American history. But George Wallace of Alabama was running as an independent and actually swept the South. He won 5 states in the 1960 election, which was Democrat Hubert Humphrey, 68, which was Democrat Hubert Humphrey against, once again, Republican Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon never could sort of get the Southern bloc behind him, but still, George Wallace won 5 states. That's the only other time in modern history, going all the way back to 1952, that an independent really had that big of an impact on the race. Now, you might remember Ross Perot did run in 1992 and to a lesser degree in 1996, but he actually didn't carry any states, not even the state of Texas. That was won by George Bush in 1992 and Bob Dole in 96.
Any other questions?
We did ask for questions on Facebook and Twitter this week. We asked our staff to contribute some questions, so I do have a few here that we can just go through. Maybe it'll inspire some of you to ask some more questions, which would be terrific. A lot of the questions we received actually dealt with the assassination, so I'm gonna tackle a couple of there. Go ahead. What do you want to say?
No, I was going to say, would you answer the question about the vice president's wives? We had someone ask us a question.
Yes.
About the role that the vice presidential candidates' wives played. So Jacqueline Kennedy was pregnant for much of 1960 and not on the campaign trail. She contributed in other ways by doing commercials and writing a syndicated newspaper column. Pat Nixon was very visible at Richard Nixon's side through every campaign appearance. But we had a question about the vice presidential wives, Mrs. Lodge, Mrs. Cabot Lodge, I don't remember her first name, and Lady Bird Johnson. So if you would talk a little bit about that.
As was the custom when running for political office, obviously the wives were always right there at their husbands' sides. Lyndon Johnson relied upon Bird, as he called her, Bird. He relied upon her quite often. In fact, she was very much sort of a political prop, because when she was by his side, it allowed Johnson to do things that were typically uncharacteristic of Lyndon Johnson, like put his hand on Bird's shoulders and sort of show off a little bit of that Southern gallantry, genteel behavior around his good lady wife, as he sometimes referred to her. So Lady Bird was essentially a political prop for Johnson. At no other time more blatantly than here in Dallas 4 days before the election, when he, knowing that there were protesters right outside the Adolphus Hotel, Johnson sort of pushed Lady Bird through the crowd and caused her to have her gloves thrown in the gutter. She was kicked and hit, and her hair was messed up and things like that.
People spit on her. It was terrible. Johnson
knew exactly what he was doing going into it, but he did it anyway because he knew that, whereas people might kind of roll their eyes and shake their heads at someone like Lyndon Johnson, the big Senate Majority Leader, getting hit on the head or spit on, when you do it to a Southern lady like Lady Bird Johnson, then you're really going into uncharted territory, and Johnson took full advantage of that and basically used it as an attack on Lady Bird Johnson to show how terrible this right-wing element was in Dallas, by default, the Republicans, and may have helped swing Texas. I mean, it was in the end, it might have been Lady Bird Johnson's hairdo getting messed up in Dallas that gave Kennedy Johnson Texas in the 1960 election. It's so crazy, but we're kind of in a crazy race right now, and I think you guys can understand the dynamic, and it's not much different than it was in 1960. Little tiny things on the campaign trail, misunderstanding what a candidate says or inferring something can totally change the dynamic of the race. Now, on the opposite side, Henry Cabot Lodge's wife, Emily Lodge, was a really sweet lady, and the Lodges were just this wonderful little cute couple. They had been married almost 35 years by the time he ran for vice president in 1960. They had met at a debutante ball back years earlier. And so Emily Lodge was in her mid-50s. She was an older woman, but she was a very stereotypical type politician's wife. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was from Massachusetts, and he was the United Nations ambassador at the time, he was a very mercurial man. He had a lot of quirks. For example, he would campaign somewhat reluctantly in the morning, but then he had to take a nap in the afternoon. But he wouldn't just take a nap. He had to stop what he was doing, put on his pajamas and go to bed. He wouldn't just take a working nap in a suit. He also had another quirk on the campaign trail, and this is where Emmy, as he called her, Emmy Lodge, came in. She had to cook him breakfast every day. Didn't matter whether they were on the road, whether they were in New York or Washington or overseas. Emmy Lodge made her husband's breakfast every morning because he would only eat what she would produce for him. In fact, when Lodge found out that Nixon had chosen him for the Republican ticket, Emmy was making breakfast, and she told a Chicago newspaper that she dropped a full pot of coffee. She was so excited, but she was in the middle of brewing some coffee, which is apropos, considering what we're talking about today, coffee with the Curators. But she dropped a full pot of coffee. But she was at her husband's side, but would never engage in politics. During the Republican National Convention, she was asked by a ladies' journal, sort of like what her influence was, and she laughed it off and said, "Oh, absolutely not. My husband handles the politics, but I'm right there by his side," apparently making him coffee and boiled eggs. But it's interesting because that dynamic has shifted to a degree, but we really don't talk all that much about the wives of the vice presidential candidates, do we? It's just not something that often comes up. But still, in 1960, they were right there, not having much political influence, but certainly influencing their men behind the scenes. Good question.
We have time for one more question, so I hope some brave soul will raise their hand and ask us a question. We hope you'll enjoy the coffee. Yes, sir.
Have you talked, I was going a little bit, have you talked about Mayor Dealey and Illinois in the 60 election?
This is a question about, again, the closeness of the election results. It all came down to Chicago, Illinois, and the relationship between the Kennedy family and Mayor Dealey and his influence on the polls and the voting. Stephen, you want to go into some detail there?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, really, there were accusations of voter fraud in Texas and in Illinois. Illinois is probably a little bit easier to prove. Even most of the Kennedy historians and biographers conclude that very likely Illinois was thrown to Kennedy. There were charges within 24 hours of the race that, the cemeteries, that were turning out a number of voters who had passed away to cast their votes for Kennedy Johnson. There's all sorts of stories, and I want to avoid speculation, but, if you talk to folks who really believe in the mafia conspiracy theories, they tie it all back to the 1960 election and say that the mob went out and helped Jack Kennedy get the vote in 1960 in Illinois, and then how dare Kennedy betray the mafia by having Bobby launch this war on organized crime, and therefore retribution was paid right here in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963. Pure speculation, but it's a really popular theory that persists to this day that goes right back to Chicago. Mayor Dealey, who was part of the very powerful and influential Dealey family, which I think is still in politics today, or in recent years, we're still in politics in Illinois. Staunch Kennedy supporter, certainly had the influence it would take to do some shenanigans behind the scenes as far as making sure that votes weren't counted, or votes maybe were counted more than once, or some votes were cast by people who really weren't living. But in the end, Kennedy did carry Illinois, and Nixon, fully aware that very likely there was some voter fraud, he opted not to fight it. But we talked earlier about the weird little quirks of history and how pointing to a geographic spot like Dealey Plaza lets you wonder what might have been had world history not changed on this spot. You can point to Chicago for something else, and it's called Watergate, because Nixon's paranoia, which he had been living with his entire life, but it hit this extreme level because he felt like the Democrats had robbed him of victory in 1960. And in many ways, Nixon felt like he was finished with politics, but he ended up going back in and running for president in 1968 and winning. But when he was preparing for re-election, he was so paranoid, again, of the Democrats, thinking back to Kennedy and Dealey in Chicago in 1960, that he was totally okay with breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel and getting dirt on the campaign because he was so afraid that the election would be stolen from him again. And it was paranoia that was Richard Nixon's downfall, and the seeds of that were planted in that 1960 election. Such is history.
Okay, now that's a story we don't talk about in the exhibit. You can just get that when you talk to Stephen.
Well, since it's just us.
But there's a lot more about the 1960 election, so I invite you to go in and enjoy the exhibit. Enjoy your coffee, but not the coffee in the exhibit. Those are in 2 separate rooms. But we hope you have a wonderful time, and we thank you very much for joining us today. We really enjoyed talking with you and answering questions. And
Thanks very much.
thank you.